Okay, good morning, folks. Appreciate you joining us. Looks like it's going to be a small, pretty intimate group today, which means pressure is going to be on you all to actually have some good conversation with us, which I think could be a good thing. I believe it will be a good thing. And so we'd like to welcome you to episode 1.2 of Meet the Researcher. We thank you for joining us today. My name is Paul Charlin. I'm the coordinator for the Tallgrass, Prairie, and Oak Savannah Fire Science Exchange, call ourselves TPOS. I'll be the host for today's event. I call this an event as opposed to webinar because we don't have a good description yet for exactly how this series goes. We don't want just to be a presentation. We want it to be a little more interactive. So hopefully pretty soon we'll be able to nail down what that means. The consortium is part of the Joint Fire Science Programs Fire Science Exchange Network. Um, we're one of 15 regional fire science exchanges around the country. Our mission is to support the use of science to make good decisions around fire management. Our focus here in TPOS is Grasslands, Oak, Savannah, and the historical Tallgrass Prairie regions. Before we get started, I'll go over some general guidelines and support of today's event. We'll try to turn microphones and video off for everyone other than myself and Michelle for now, just in an attempt to help avoid accidental interruptions. And again, our intent is to engage you all in a discussion. We'll begin with a presentation, shorter than you might be used to for a webinar. And again, that's to give us a lot of room for discussion and give folks a chance to weigh in and offer some thoughts and their experiences. And we want to spend a little less time with, the gory methodological statistics and details, and again, focus more on conclusions and applications. So we hope you'll have some thoughts and can help initiate some discussions. During the presentation, feel free to use the chat if you've got questions or some resources come up you'd like to share. I'll keep an eye on that. And after that, I think with especially a small group as this is, we can make sure and turn on microphones and give folks a chance to ask questions in their own voice. I think that usually works better than me trying to interpret what it is you're saying. And then at the end of the presentation, a short evaluation is going to pop up in your browser. And we hope that you take a couple of minutes to offer some feedback, especially as we develop this new format. So knowing what works for you can be very helpful, and we appreciate that. Okay, having said all that, so today's presenter is Michelle Homann. She's a PhD candidate in the Damshin Lab at the UW-Madison, and I will let her provide her background and begin the presentation. So welcome, Michelle.
Thanks, Paul. So today I will be talking about just a couple of my chapters in my dissertation. I have other things that I've studied as well, and I'm happy to talk about those if conversation goes there at the end. But broadly, I'll be talking about measuring tallgrass prairie responses to disturbance type and timing to improve predictability during restoration. I want to start by just giving some background about myself so that you know where I'm coming from and where I'm headed next, and kind of give you some positionality for where I'm at. So in 2019, I was in undergrad and I did an internship with the Mississippi Valley Conservancy out of La Crosse, Wisconsin, and really fell in love with bluff-top prairies and grasslands in general. I graduated with a bachelor's in environmental biology in winter of 2019, and then started graduate school at UW-Madison in 2021. So I've been there for just about 5 years now, and a lot of my work has focused on things that hopefully managers will use, questions that are applicable to management. And I've shared that work at a lot of manager-focused conferences and some field trips to our field sites. I'm wrapping up my PhD now, so I'll be defending in about a month and then getting my dissertation written over the summer. I've also started working with adaptive restoration as a restoration specialist and land manager. So I kind of started in restoration work and hands-on in the field, and that's where I'm headed next now that I have some more knowledge about restoration generally. So things I want to talk about today are just kind of a broad overview of predictability and restoration and what makes it difficult. And then I'll talk about the experiment that I've been using to test some questions, what we've learned in that experiment and why it matters for management. And then we'll open things up for a discussion between all of us. So to start, I'm sure you are all familiar with the historic range of tallgrass prairies across North America, including parts of Wisconsin where I work. And in the past, disturbance typically happened fairly frequently, every 3 to 5 years, in the mid to late growing season. And now, current management is more dormant season burns where we're burning in either the spring or the fall. And we kind of avoid the growing season burns for a variety of good reasons. But that means that litter is removed at different times of year than the plants are sort of adapted to. And so I've been interested in what the effects are of those different fire timings. And then another thing that we're facing is the loss of fire regime where we just can't get fire on the ground as often as we should in as many places as needed. And so that can cause an increase in litter accumulation and reduce plant diversity among a number of other negative consequences. So the broad question that I've been asking in my research is how does disturbance timing affect plant communities? And we know that restoration requires disturbance, at least in these fire-dependent grasslands. And so one of the things that happens when we burn at different times is we affect when leaf litter is present over winter or whether it's present over winter. And that can affect the timing of events during the growing season because insulation is different in spring when the plants are starting to grow. And this could eventually lead to changes in the plant community, but it's tough to observe changes in the plant community over relatively short time scales. And so I've been trying to ask questions that get at how the plant community might change, even though we're not necessarily seeing wholesale community turnover yet. So we have an experiment set up out at Mounds View Grassland, which is owned and managed by the Prairie enthusiasts. It's in Iowa County, and we have 8 experimental blocks set up out there. The site itself was restored in 2011 from corn and soy rotational agriculture through planting seeds. And in 2016, we established these experimental blocks that you can see from Google Earth, which is kind of fun. And so in those treatments, I'll explain what they are, but I also want to note that I have kind of what we theorize is the amount of litter that's present in early spring. And when I say litter, I just mean senesced plant material that died over the previous growing season or after the previous growing season. And so our treatments include a fall burn where litter is removed before winter, kind of in November and December. And there's really not anything above the soil surface if the burn is relatively complete in those treatments. Then we have a fall mow treatment, which we've been applying in November. And the litter is there, but the density is different than in other scenarios that I'll talk about. And it's also typically shorter. Then we have spring burns, which we've been conducting in April, where the litter is removed in spring. And so in early spring, potentially when some of the plants start growing, there's this pretty light, airy layer of litter, but it still provides some insulation. And then we also have an unburned treatment where we haven't burned at all since 2016. And so depending on when I was taking measurements, there was up to 7 years of litter accumulation or more. Oh, and one other thing to note is that we've been applying these treatments annually, so it's a pretty aggressive disturbance regime. So then the questions that I'm going to focus on today are how these treatments affect when plants come up and how quickly they grow. You'll note that the fall mow is kind of faded out here because I only asked this question in the fall burn, spring burn, and undisturbed treatments. And to answer this question, we identified individual plants and followed them throughout the entire growing season. So we put little sewing pins by them and measured how fast they grew, recorded when they came up. And they start really little like this and they end up growing into plants that are sometimes taller than me. And then the second question that I'll talk about today is how productivity and community composition differ between these treatments. And to answer this question, we collected biomass out of the prairie in July, so around peak growing season. And we sorted the biomass by species so that we could get an idea of how the plant community was changing. So what we've learned so far is to start with when plants come up in the spring. I'll have just the week of the year. So week 13 is March 27th, and this axis will go through June 26th. On the x-axis, and then on the y-axis, it's the number of plants that came up in each treatment. And the lines that will come up on the graph will show how many individuals were up at a given time. So what we find is that established plants emerged faster in a fall burn treatment than the spring burn and undisturbed treatments. And essentially what that means is that the rate of emergence is faster in this fall burn treatment, and then kind of intermediate in the spring burn treatment in green, and the lowest in the undisturbed treatments. And another thing that's of note is that in this undisturbed treatment where we hadn't burned for 7 years, there are fewer individuals overall, whereas in both the burn treatments, we got about the same number of individuals coming up in each treatment. And this is for a suite of 12 species that we sampled, and we sampled them at the meters squared scale. So there are up to 120 plants across each treatment. So getting into why these trends matter, an earlier start to the growing season in fall burn treatments could increase productivity. It could affect other phenological events. And so, yeah, it's interesting to know if things are coming up at different times as a response to when we decide to disturb them. And then getting into how fast plants grow. On the x-axis here, I'll have the week of 2023 when an individual emerged. So emergence timing essentially will be on the x-axis. And then how quickly the plants grew is on the y-axis, and this is in centimeters squared per week. So it's basically how wide the plant is and how tall it is put together. And then we did the spring burn treatment in week 15, which was in mid-April. So there are kind of two things going on here. The first is that plants that came up earlier grew faster. So there's kind of this big flush of growth early in the growing season, and then plants grow slower as the growing season progresses. But then we also see that this green dotted line for the spring burn shows that plants grew especially fast in the spring burn treatments. So that rate is pretty consistently higher than the fall burn treatments. And for about half the growing season, it's higher in the spring burn than the unburned treatments as well. And so what this tells us is that even though plants that were burned in spring didn't come up as early as the fall burned plants, they are able to sort of compensate for that by growing faster throughout the growing season. And so it turns out that kind of towards the middle of the growing season, percent cover or like the canopy cover of these different treatments is the same. Then getting into the productivity question where we collected biomass, we see that I'll back up for a second. So I have disturbance treatments on the x-axis and then above ground biomass on the y-axis. And I've separated these graphs out into functional groups. So C3 grasses are cool season grasses, our warm season C4 grasses, and then the flowering forbs. And what we find here is for C3 grasses, which is relatively unsurprising, the spring burn treatment knocked back productivity compared to the other disturbance treatments. And those C3 grasses are mostly Kentucky bluegrass and smooth brome. So they're introduced pasture grasses that aren't really things that we want in a restored prairie. Then for C4 grasses, the spring burn had the greatest effect, but it was in the opposite direction. So we actually see more productivity in C4 grasses in the spring burn. And those C4 grasses are our native kind of cornerstone species like big blue stem, switchgrass, Indian grass, and side oats. And then the forbs were surprising to me because we've been applying these treatments for, close to a decade at this point, and we didn't see any significant difference in productivity across the treatments. So that was interesting. There are definitely some differences in richness and diversity, but the actual biomass that's being produced by forbs is very similar across treatments. And so the kind of takeaway here is that burning, as we know more or less, is like this is an effect that has been observed anecdotally by many people, I'm sure, including people here. But burning at different times of year promotes different groups of species. And dominant grasses do especially well when they're burned in spring. I think this is an especially important takeaway for people who are struggling with, big blue stem maybe taking over their restorations or outcompeting forbs. So that's something to consider, is avoiding spring burns if you're specifically having issues with big blue stem or other C4 grasses. So then bringing it back to this kind of graphic that I had at the start, I just want to summarize the findings that we found. The first is that burning in spring or fall compared to mowing or not doing any sort of disturbance promotes different growth rates across these disturbances. So plants come up later but grow faster in the spring, and they emerge earlier but grow slower in the fall burn treatments. And then we also saw reduced C3 grass productivity when we burned in spring. We saw increased C4 grass productivity when we burned in spring, and this is compared to all of the other treatments. And then some kind of broader takeaways are that disturbance, of course, is important, and there are pros and cons to spring and fall burn timing, where the decisions that you make around disturbance will need to depend a little bit more on the context that you're working in. But generally, established perennial plants are very resilient in these grassland systems. We've been burning every year for close to a decade at this point, and we haven't seen any plants drop out of one treatment over the other. At least not plants that we wanted to be there. We've seen some changes in introduced plants like clover and the C3 grasses, but native plants are pretty stable in these ecosystems, even if we're burning every year. And so that means that there's some room to be creative with management. Um, a lot of people burn more in the spring than in the fall, and I don't think there are really any stark downsides to that. But it is good practice to keep records, and if you decide to mow or something instead of burning, if you're struggling to get fire on the landscape, it's important to kind of note what the differences are when you're doing things like that. And so with that, I have a lot of people to thank for their help with this work. It's been an ongoing project, and so we've had a lot of folks help us collect data. If you want to keep up with what we're doing in the Damshin Lab, here is a QR code with a link to our website. And then, of course, I want to thank the Joint Fire Science Program, along with the Prairie Enthusiasts and a couple of other funding sources here. And if you'd like to get in contact with me after the talk, my email is right here. And then with that, we are all set to have a conversation.
Well, thanks, Michelle. We appreciate you taking the time to share what you found with us. It's interesting stuff. I haven't seen anything in the chat yet, so I guess we can kind of kick off some discussion ourselves and hope that folks will offer up some observations or some thoughts. One of the first things we'd like to know and hope folks will tell us is, does this align with your experience? Do you have some data? Do you have some observations, some thoughts? And if what those observations are they similar? Are they different? Does this reinforce what you think, or does this challenge what you think? Well, we do have one question. We can start with that one. Do you have any
Yeah,
plans to look at other durations between treatments? Be curious to see if the effects on forbs or C4 grasses are different with, say, 3 years between treatments.
yeah, that's a great question. We don't specifically have plans to do that, although we are probably moving away from annual burning in this specific experiment. And so there will be room to go back and see what the effects are after a few years instead of burning every year. Um, I do know that a number of people also recommend burning annually at the start of restoration. And so this is a relatively realistic, scenario where people try to, if they can, they try to burn pretty often at the start. Um, but I do think that responses would be different if the fire return interval was longer. Namely, I think that forbs would probably benefit from longer fire return intervals. Um, that's something that's been seen across a number of research studies, is that forbs just need a little bit of time to recover. And so what might be happening is that they're getting disturbed too often in all three disturbance treatments, and then they've not been disturbed often enough in the unburned treatment. And so they're kind of leveling out in two different, like in response to two different kinds of stressors.
So here's a question. Were there enough native cool season, early emerging warm season gramineaus to track the effect on them for fall versus spring burns?
For, is that for native cool seasons? Is that the question?
Yes.
Um, we we have some native cool season grasses. We have Elemis, which is Canada wild rye, but not enough to be able to tell kind of what's going on. We also have prairie dropseed here and there in these plots, but again, it's not enough replication to really know what's happening. Um, I do we also have Bicknell's sedge. Let's see, I'm looking at that list of species now. We have a tiny bit of June grass that's starting to show up. Um, but yeah, for the most part, we just don't have the replication yet. I would think that native cool season grasses would respond differently because they are adapted to fire, and so they might not, drop out as dramatically or be as harmed by spring burn timing. I think that they're they're adapted to fire, they're better able to resprout after fire. We might actually even see a flush of growth where they benefit from spring burns, but we just don't have the replication to answer that question.
I'd be curious, was that Gabriel that asked this question? If you work on sites that do have those, and what would your experience has been if you have those? And if you'd like to come on and answer that, you're welcome to unmute yourself and do that. Or I can unmute you if you can't.
Well, I don't have personal experience, but I did read a long-term Kansas study that found that native cool season grasses decreased with mid and late spring burns while they remained at fairly good abundance with winter, which was sort of late fall and early spring burns. So it doesn't seem like in that study they found that they were better at resprouting when um, injured by fire than non-native cool season grasses.
Good. Thank
Interesting.
you.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks for bringing that up. There's been at least a couple of questions about pollinators. I don't think that's been part of your study, Michelle, but has anybody else in this project done any work on that you know of?
Not at this site specifically. I know that a fair amount of work has been done with pollinators, um, in prairies generally in response to fire. I will say, as far as flowering goes, so pollinator resources, um, burning in spring or fall will generally increase flowering. And so disturbance is important for pollinators as well. But whether frequency or timing, how frequency and timing matters is not something that I have been studying.
Yeah, thank you. Appreciate your observation, even if you don't have any details. Although, like as you mentioned, there was some difference in flowering response, which again is probably a positive thing for our pollinators. Yeah. So let me circle back. You mentioned that this site was managed by prairie enthusiasts, and there was some reference to future operations. Is there some plan for this to to continue to exist or to grow, to change at all? What's the future hold?
Yeah, so we're having conversations about that right now. Um, our current funding is wrapping up in about a year. So we'll have another growing season of sampling. And then we are planning to put in permanent markers for these plots so that we can go back and revisit them at whatever time intervals make sense to whoever's next in the research line. Um, and so, yeah, I think the plan right now is to have like kind of return these plots back to the prairie enthusiasts to manage with the rest of the landscape. And so they'll be burned in spring or fall every 2 to 3 years, but they won't be separated out by treatment anymore. And it's likely that we'll see the effects of 10 years of repeated disturbance in the same season even after we start burning everything at the same time. So there's definitely room to keep asking questions, but we won't be disturbing in such controlled manners anymore.
And do you know, will these plots or this data continue to be managed to the Damshin lab? So if we want to kind of follow along, that's the place to go to keep track.
Yes.
Excellent. Um, Again, we're still open to questions. I see a question about forb diversity. Did you, we talked about overall forb response. Were you able to kind of tease that out to which forbs responded in different ways?
We do have, so I have a bunch of huge tables that show how about 50 species responded to these treatments. Um, for the most part, the productivity was similar across treatments. Um, there were a couple weird things happening, like Silphium laciniatum compass plant responded really positively to the Mo treatment compared to
Hmm.
undisturbed or burn treatments. And so, yeah, I think there are a couple species that probably, prefer to be in one treatment or the other. And I imagine it depends on when they start growing. And so whether they're dealing with competition versus dealing with direct damage from disturbance. Um, but and then I see too, there's a question about the frequency of disturbance and whether disturbing so often is harming form diversity. Um, and we have a paper out that came out last year where we talk a little bit about how diversity is changing, not at the species level, but in general, so far, we're not seeing negative effects of the repeated disturbance compared to undisturbed. We don't have the sort of temporal variability to be able to make conclusions beyond that. Like it would be awesome if we could compare burning every year to burning every 2 or 3 years. Um, and I do think that forbs would respond positively to a longer fire return interval, where we would see more diversity or certainly more productivity in the forbs if we didn't burn quite as often.
The word that jumps out to me and reading, listening to your results and is the competition. I mean, this is really what kind of you, the manager, using data, these and other similar studies is you have some capacity now to affect your outcomes, which really is your goal. And I'm curious if folks can speak to how they think about that, especially when they've got, you've got certainly a long-term vision for your site, and yet you're working within short-term constraints. What happened this year? What are we expecting to happen? In terms of snow cover is, relevant. And I'm wondering if folks would be willing to talk about that and see what you have to say. And again, if you like to speak up, you're welcome to unmute yourself and weigh in. We'd love to hear it. So did you look at any environmental data? Thinking about like the potential effects of, snow versus no snow and having been burned and dark soils. Were there any data from say annual temperatures or rainfall that went into your calculations?
Yes, yeah. So I actually have another slide about that in case this had come up. Um, where I have, so we put what are called Tomst loggers out, and they're about 8 inches long. Half of them goes underground and measures soil moisture, and then there's a data logger right at the soil surface that measures soil temperature. And so I think I have that as my next slide, unless I have it hidden. Let's see. Oh, there it is. Um, so this figure shows, there we are. On the x-axis, it's the disturbance treatments, and then this first panel is soil temperature in winter. And that scales really predictably with this litter scale that I showed during the methods, where it's coldest if we burn in the fall and there's no litter present, and it's warmest if we don't disturb and we just let litter accumulate. And of course, accumulated litter is bad for a number of reasons, including, reducing the number of seeds that make contact with the soil, can also make it harder for plants to emerge from the soil. And so warmer is not necessarily better. Colder is also not necessarily worse. It just depends on which species you're trying to favor. And then on the right side here, I have spring soil moisture. So this will coincide kind of with right when the plants are starting to grow, where we don't see as predictable of a scale with the litter depth. Get my pointer back out. But we do see that, again, the moisture is kind of the lowest in the fall burn treatment because there's not insulation over the soil. And then it kind of flattens out with the other amounts of litter. Another thing that I will say is in scenarios where we have less snowfall over winter, we also see less soil moisture through the growing season. And so the persistence of snow is really important because it melts differently. It's an influx of moisture at the start of the growing season. Whereas if it rains during the winter, that can either run off of the frozen soil or it's not stored moisture above the soil in the same way that snow is. And so the amount of snow that we get over winter also really affects soil moisture.
Any other thoughts from folks listening in? So I'm curious, you mentioned early on, I think in your introduction, you mentioned something about interacting with some managers or, manager questions. And number one, I appreciate what I heard as, a real focus on management needs. And I'm wondering if you can kind of talk about how that played into what you specifically and this project more broadly, kind of how this was um, envisioned and guided and yeah.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, so as part of kind of this entire experimental process, we've had managers involved to kind of co-create the questions that we're asking. Rich Henderson out at with the Prairie Enthusiasts, who manages this site, is out there with us every year, he'll often come out with us at the beginning of the growing season for a day. And he also does our mow treatments, and he'll come out and help with burn breaks. And so we've had a lot of conversations with him about where he can see this project going and what kinds of questions would be useful for him. We also have had field trips every summer for the past 3 summers where folks from the DNR and the Nature Conservancy, prairie enthusiasts, of course, and then we've had people from adaptive restoration come out because they burn our plots. And so they come out and see what's going on following the treatments that they're applying. And so the biomass question that I asked about productivity was actually the direct result of a field trip where managers told me, here's something that we don't really know yet that we're hoping to see at least, published on paper. Because, like, for example, spring burning reducing C3 grass cover is something that a lot of people observe, but it's not necessarily something that's been published. I also asked a question about seedling survival, and I was just talking to Rich Henderson about this the other day, because we sowed seeds in the winter, and then so we burned in the fall, sowed seeds in the winter, and then for our spring burn treatments, we burned the spring following seed edition, and we saw that the spring burn treatment reduced total seedling establishment. And that's something that Rich had not ever read before. He anecdotally, he kind of thought it is probably not a good idea to burn right after you sow seeds, but to actually see it tested and written down somewhere is something that he was happy to see. And so, yeah, we've been trying to ask questions that managers have in their heads already.
Well, I'm sure they appreciate that. Certainly, from our perspective and within the consortium, we appreciate that. That's our goal, is to bring the managers and the research and the users together. So thank you very much for that. There's another question about the completeness of the burns. I'd be interested in if there's any observations or data around that.
Yeah, we don't have recorded data really about completeness. Typically, the burns are quite complete, although our fall burn last year was pretty patchy. I think that it depends on, relative humidity and fuel moisture and stuff. And so we sometimes see patchier burns. I think more often in the fall burn window, just because it's a tighter window than the spring. And so if conditions are good enough to burn, we're going to burn. Whereas in the spring, there could be a number of weeks that are good enough to burn rather than a few days in the fall. Okay, and then, yeah, in terms of overwintering for insects, I don't know about insects, but I have found a couple of mouse nests at the bases of grass that have made it through burns. So yeah, I think there are definitely little refugia in there where insects or small mammals could persist. Of course, we also are burning a very small section of the overall preserve, and I think that is an important component of planning burns, is that you leave areas unburned so that you're not completely wiping out a population of anything that is of concern.
I think another component of that is having talked with at least one bee researcher. So, sometimes a more thorough burn. I won't say complete, spatially complete. Um, but some large percentage of our bee species are ground nesters, and so the removal of the thatch is beneficial for that suite of species. So it really highlights just the complexity of the decision making of the decisions our managers have to make on a day-to-day basis. And it's a pretty tough task. And we, admire you for taking that on. And hopefully we can support you with more data.
Yeah, that is one thing that I want to emphasize is that, I've conducted all of these experiments at the same site, and context is really important for what's going on in any given site. You have the context of what was planted and then what is actually at your site. You have the age of a restoration, you have surrounding areas. If you have a cornfield next to your restoration versus a remnant prairie, you're going to have some different pressures going on. And so that's something to always consider. I think these results are relatively generalizable to restorations, especially post-agricultural restoration. But yeah, I would be interested to know if people have observed similar or different trends depending on their context. 'Cause, some of the things that I'll highlight is we saw earlier growth in the fall burns, like, and we have the two treatments side by side, so you can really see, the spring burn is black and charred, and the fall burn already has some green coming up. And then also I've heard a few people say that it seems like big blue stem is really favored by spring burns. So that's another thing I'd be interested if that's context dependent at all, or another context is weather in a given year. And so if you have a drought, you might see less productivity overall, and that could affect the productivity results that I have, for example. So yeah, context is really important for any sort of restoration, and it's definitely a good thing to consider, instead of just, broadly thinking that anything is applicable to a given site.
Again, reinforces that challenge. And again, it's probably important to reinforce that these were planted sites. These are reconstructions as opposed to remnants. And so you might say your challenges are different, your risks are a little different, and your rewards potentially are as well. And so that's a whole different suite of uh, data that probably would be useful to have answered at some point somewhere. We've got a couple more minutes if anybody else has any thoughts or concerns, questions. So maybe this will put you on the spot just a little bit, Michelle. So as you transition in your career, what do you think you will take from this?
Yeah, that's a
Moving,
great question.
yeah.
Um, yeah, I think, first the context dependent piece where every site is different. I think that I'm starting to see that already. I was out on a burn on Saturday, and one of them was super easy to get things to go. The like really complete burns, and then the second site we went to, the relative humidity was coming up a little bit, and it was a wetter site, and so we were really struggling to get anything to burn, and it was a lot less complete. And so even just two places on the same day can burn a lot differently. And so, that's something to to keep in mind going forward for me is just that we're going to see really different results wherever we're at. I think too that, I'm excited to be in some different sort of contexts because we have a suite of, probably 60 or 70 species out here. Most of them were seeded. And so getting into a remnant prairie or a dry versus a wet prairie, we're going to see different species and what's going on with water availability and any number of other things is going to affect how plants respond to the kinds of management that we're doing. So yeah, that's something that I'll take with for sure, is just really putting myself in the position of the plant and thinking, what are the constraints on how a plant might respond to what we're doing.
Think like a plant. I like that. Well, one last chance for folks to ask any questions or speak up. I think we just had another question come in.
Yeah, I
Gabriel, we
see that.
appreciate you asking a lot of questions.
Yeah, so this question is about early spring blooming plants like puccoon or violets, blue-eyed grass, wood betony as well. We have, let's see, we have wood betony in our sites, and I didn't specifically look at flowering in the, I think we really only have one patch of wood betony and it's in a spring burn. And it's doing really well. So I don't know if that is a useful answer or not, but it's, the cover is a little bit greater every year. And so we're clearly not harming wood betony by burning in the spring. We don't have pasque-flower or prairie violets right in our sites. There is a remnant area a little ways away from our treatments, which we, of course, have not been burning experimentally. But yeah, I would think that it's going to depend on species again and what their kind of adaptive strategies are. I see also the comment about wood betony reducing intensity of burns by reducing the height of tall grasses. That is definitely something we have observed. They're like the percent cover of big blue stem in a lot of these plots is pushing 80%, and it's like 2% in the wood betony plots. So yeah, I would think the amount of litter that's there to carry fire is definitely lower, and so the intensity is lower too. That's a great point.
Competition.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Michelle, thank you very much for taking your time to talk to us today, and thanks for the work that you've done. And where can folks look to see final results of your work? Where could they go if they want to see all the gory details?
Yeah, I'm working on getting those publications out now. The first one about emergence timing and growth rate is in the copy editing phase, so it should be out in the next couple of weeks with ecological applications, and that'll be posted on the Damshin Lab website. I'll put that up again, so folks can check the QR code if you haven't yet. Every publication that comes out of this project will be posted on the lab website. And then we're also working on research briefs as the full articles get published so that we can send out the highlights and what they mean for management. Um, I'm meeting with one of my fellow researchers from this project actually on Thursday to get the editing done on one of our research briefs. So we'll send that around to JFSP and also post it on the lab website. But yeah, so keep an eye on the website. We'll also send notifications anytime something gets published so JFSP can distribute that as well. And they're
Thank you
all
very
open
much.
access. We care about publishing open access so that people can read it even if they're not associated with a university or a research entity.
Super helpful. Thank you very much.
It's
Well,
my
it looks
pleasure.
like
Thank you for having me.
pleasure was ours. Well, thanks again to all of you for sticking around and asking questions and listening to the very end. And we will get this posted, get the recording posted as soon as possible. And again, when you log out, if you see the survey, we appreciate if you take a couple minutes to answer just a few questions to kind of help us refine our products and keep you all informed to the best of our ability. So thank you again.